Look at these bees bringing in the nectar. It's a beautiful thing. It's springtime here down under, and well, it's almost spring, and the bees are bringing in the nectar, which is so fantastic to see. So for the people in the northern and eastern areas of Australia, we'll be putting on flow supers onto their hives, and up north in the northern hemisphere it's the other way around, where some people are removing supers to pack them down for winter. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that today. If you've got questions, put them in the comments below and we'll answer them. But the theme is removing the flow super, which is the top box here. If you're new to beekeeping, all the terminology is a little bit to learn, but the super is the top box, the honey collection area, and that's where the magic happens with our flow frames, allowing you to harvest the honey right out of the hive without taking the box off. So we call that a flow super. But a box with conventional honeycomb frames in it is also called a super. If there's an excluder here and this is the brood nest, then the box above will be called a super. You can have multiple supers or multiple brood boxes, so it can get a bit confusing. So here, putting on supers, we do that when the colony is ready and there's also a good nectar flow. So we have covered that specifically, showing you how to do it, preparing your super and putting your box on. So have a look for those videos. We'll put some in the links below if you want a step-by-step of adding your super and when to do it. But basically, you need to have the bees full in the bottom box, meaning they've drawn out all the combs, they've finished all their wax, and they've built up to the point where you open the lid and you see lots of bees on top of the frames. And that's the time to add your super. But if you add it too early, or when there's perhaps not a honey flow ahead, there's not a lot of flowers predicted ahead, then you'll find they won't do much with it until that nectar flow happens. And that's exactly what happened with the hive up here. We actually put this on a few months ago and nothing really happened. And we did those demonstrations of encouraging them up there with putting chunks of wax from the brood nest and putting it in the on the flow frame surface, and then they recycle that wax in the area. But still nothing much happened. They did recycle the wax, but just now we're seeing activity. The bees are coming up, they're joining all the flow frame parts together, and they're actually starting to add a bit of nectar. So they're away. And the bees waited to do that until there was a nectar flow. So the two things you need in order to put your super in and get honey storage happening is the bees built up enough to put your super on and a good nectar flow in the area. If you have a look at the rear window here, you can see there's no sign of honey here yet, but in the middle you can see a whole lot of bees working those frames. So it won't be very long till we start to see a bit of nectar appearing. Now, I'm not sure if you can see that, but down in between the frames there's a lot of bees working back to back as they cover all those cells in wax and join the parts together and start storing the nectar. If we have a look on the other side, it's a wonderful thing to be able to look in and see what the bees are doing. You can see that they're joining all the parts together, and you can even see a couple of cells of nectar where they've deposited the nectar and are going through that amazing process of reducing the water content down. So if you're in the southern area of Australia, it might still be too early, it might still be a bit cold and there's not much of a nectar flow yet, and you might wait to put on your super. Or if you're in the more east or northern areas of Australia, you might find that you've still got the super on from last year and you never have to take it off unless the bees really are showing that they've dwindled in numbers for some reason, whether it be they've gone queenless or something like that. So here we're in the luxury position where we don't get snow. This is our winter now and there's a good nectar flow coming in. So once the colony is established, we just leave the honey super on all year round, and that makes it easy for us. However, if you're in an area with long cold winters and snow build-up, generally beekeepers will remove honey supers for the winter, or they might move some supers and leave one, because in the end you're juggling a few things where you need to have stores for the bees to survive a long cold winter. So they need some honey stores, and if they don't have any, you'll need to feed them some sugar syrup prior to winter in order for them to build up enough stores to last through till the springtime, because the honey is what they need to keep the hive warm. They need to consume that to stay alive. They disengage their wing muscles, they vibrate, they produce heat, and that's how they combat a very cold winter and survive through. So there's honey stores, and then there's the size of your box. The reason why beekeepers remove some supers and pack it down for winter is if you've got a really tall hive and the colony's naturally shrinking down as they do for the winter time, then it just might be hard for the bees to keep that whole area nice and warm for the winter. So having a smaller, reduced size hive for the winter means that your bees might have a better chance of surviving. There's some more factors involved, and if you decide to leave your flow super on for winter, if you've got a long cold winter, then you should at least remove the queen excluder. The reason why that is, if you've got a cluster of bees keeping warm down in the bottom box and they move up to consume the honey, the queen can't get through the excluder and she could perish in the cold below while the bees have all moved up and hanging out in a super, or perhaps you've got another box on top of this and they've moved right up and left the queen behind. I'm not an expert, I've never had snow around my hives, so take your advice from people in your area if you do have snow and that long cold winter, and decide how you're going to manage your hive. In the end, they need stores, they need a suitable sized home to keep warm for the winter, and another thing you might need to consider is snow build-up at the entrance. So some people like to run a top entrance, which you can do just by drilling a hole in your box somewhere here up the top, and that will give the bees an entrance that they can fly out if the snow builds up above this bottom entrance here, or if the bees, because bees naturally die, and if they're not flying, they're not taking those bees out, if the bees block the entrance because there's so many dead bees building up during that winter time. So quite a few factors to consider. Again, I'm not an expert in those cold areas. Fred Dunn's got some great videos, we can put in the links below. We've also got a in-depth beekeeping course called thebeekeeper.org, which has experts from around the world contributing to all sorts of topics that we don't cover here. So you can take a look at that, it's free to try. It's made to take you from knowing nothing about bees all the way through to a deep scientific knowledge of bees. Any questions, put them in the comments below and we'll answer those.
Great, Cedar, great, we've got our ambassador joining us this morning as well, Peter Cox. Here's an interesting question. Someone's asking, you call the brood box a brood box, why is the super called a super box and not a honey box?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer. I don't know where it got the name super, but it's super confusing really for a lot of people getting in. I wonder if anybody knows the answer to that, put it in the comments below. You could certainly just call it a honey box and a brood box. That would make a lot more sense. Beekeeping's generally come from people keeping bees in old kerosene boxes and things like that that were just around, and that's where we got our Langstroth sizes. Langstroth in the beginning didn't specify a specific size of box that we follow today. That developed through people just using what they had around them, and the term super may have come that way as well.
That's a super answer, Cedar.
Thanks,
Hey,
Trace.
someone's asking, can you or how can you split a hive in winter, or would you split a hive in winter?
Here we could split a hive in probably the late winter around now, when the bees are building up and we know there's a nectar flow ahead. If you live in the colder regions of Australia, then you probably wouldn't be splitting a hive in winter. You wouldn't do that till the spring really turned. So winter is a confusing term. It's more like, would you split a hive when there wasn't any nectar around? And the answer is no. You want to have an abundant source of nectar and pollen ahead so that that hive split can get on its feet, can build up some stores, can make their bee bread, can feed it to the young and build up, and then have a good chance of becoming a nice thriving colony. So here it's unfair to say the bees really have a winter. These are European honeybees. We don't really have a European winter.
Right. This is a bit of a big one from Lauren, central western New South Wales. Installed a nuke a few weeks ago and it's been really cold and wet, and haven't had a chance to check the 3 foundationless frames that she had added. Just wondering, when should she check the hive to add the super? There's lots of canola crops around, but just worried that it's been really cold and rainy.
So bees are amazing at surviving through cold and rain and hot and dry. They're incredibly resourceful. So your bees should be fine during that time. If you've started from a nuke, they've already got a going colony, they've already got some honey and pollen stores. They will be able to survive with just the frames they have for quite a long time. So I wouldn't be overly concerned. I would just wait for a nice warm sunny day, pop the lid, have a look in, and just see how they're going on those new foundationless frames.
Great. Adam's wondering, everyone's loving the view and the beautiful day we've got here today, and he's just wondering if you ever fancy jacking it all in and becoming an electrician.
Yeah, I'm actually a bit fond of electrical work. I used to install solar panels and things, and I still do a bit of that kind of thing, just on more of a hobbyist, inventor type style. So I certainly get into technical stuff, but as said, I probably won't swap your jobs. It is quite good here.
Cedar, a few people in Australia actually, all their flow hives are obviously arriving, getting ready for spring. Just wondering, where's the best place should people sort of start to contact to actually get their bees?
That's a great question, and the answer is locally is best if you can, because those bees are used to the environmental factors in that area, and bees have quite a bit quite a quick turnover, if you like, of genetics. So they are able to adapt and change to the area they are in. So if you can go to your local bee breeders, have a look online, ask around, see who's got bees, then the easiest way is to go and buy a nucleus. It's a good time to get in early, get your order in. So in the springtime here in Australia, you can get your colony going and take advantage of the big boom of flowers we get in springtime. The other way you could go, if you can't find a colony to buy, is find somebody with bees and take a split. We've got videos showing you just how to do that. And if you're the type of person that really likes to jump in there, you could have a go, but probably recommend you get someone experienced with you to help you take that split, and then you can start your colony that way. It's basically taking some frames out of the brood box and putting them into your hive and looking after them. If they've got the resources to make a queen, they probably will do so. However, buying a queen off a queen breeder, then you've got more known genetics, and if you want a nice, calm, productive hive, then that's a good way to get it, is buy in an already mated queen, take a split, and you can grow your hive from that. A couple of weeks ago on our live stream we showed you just how to take a split with my sister's hive, which is just near here.
Great. Few people coming in, of course, asking questions about when to remove the super, but just so you all know, Cedar's getting to that soon. Cedar, Jess is asking, when you do add the super here in Australia, do you need to check the brood for diseases or anything like that before you actually add the super?
It's always a good idea, and it's a mandatory requirement here in Australia and many other countries to go through your brood nest at least a couple of times a year and check for disease issues. So you're looking for signs of AFB or EFB, which are basically sunken dark brood cappings, sometimes with a piercing in them. And if you see that, then there's actually a free test you can send away to find out whether that is the issue. And that's an important one to do. It is around and it could get into your hive. Fingers crossed you won't have to encounter that. I didn't encounter that kind of thing for probably 20 years of beekeeping on a bigger scale, but it is more around these days, so fingers crossed you don't get anything like that, but always being on the lookout is a good idea. Checking your bees are happy and healthy in your brood box, and then putting your super on. Great tip.
Great. Michelle from Brisbane's heard that you should have a certain percentage of brood and bees before adding a super. They've heard that it should be 80% brood on 80% of the frames and 90% coverage of bees on 90% of the frames. What do you recommend?
That sounds like a pretty good rule of thumb. Generally we recommend that all the combs are drawn out, so that's they've built their honeycomb out on the frames. If you're using foundation, they would have attached their honeycomb cells and drawn it out further into full frames. If you're using foundationless, then they would have hung their beautiful comb from the comb guide at the top. And when all of the frames are built out, open the lid and you're seeing a lot of bees, that's a good time to add the super, provided there's a predicted nectar flow ahead. So this is a great time to be doing it in this location because we can actually see nectar coming into the hives. We can see a lot of things starting to flower, and we know there's a spring ahead. You probably wouldn't be adding a super if there's perhaps you're in the northern hemisphere and the season's definitely coming to a close. It's going to be the other way around, where you're taking off boxes if you've got multiple stacked boxes on your hive, and preparing your hive to survive the winter time.
Great. Lee's messaging in from central Victoria, where they get lots of frosts but no snow. Is it okay to leave the super on all year? The answer might be best from your local beekeepers, and ask for a few opinions on that. And if there's some people from that area, chime in on the thread to help answer the question. That I would probably say you could go either way. You might, if you've got multiple stacked boxes, you might reduce it to just a brood and one super. And it's just a more smaller size might be easier for your bees to keep warm during the winter time. You also need honey stores for your bees, so you're going to need to leave either a second brood box, which is probably mainly honey, or a flow super or a conventional super on that has stores in it for your bees to eat during the winter time. Having said that, you can get a single brood box to survive through the winter as well. So it's more about having the stores for the size of your colony to live on and keep warm during the winter time. So if you've got, if you decide to leave it on, then I would take out the excluder for winter, just in case the bees move up to the top and leave the queen behind. You don't want her to perish in the cold below the excluder. So removing the excluder would be what I'd do if you decide to go ahead and leave the flow super on for the winter. What do you recommend, Cedar, is the best flow hive for beginner beekeepers?
So about half of our beekeepers using our flow hives are brand new to beekeeping, and any of our models will suit. Of course, our latest model has more features that make things a little bit easier, so we would recommend that. However, you can get started with any of the models and get going. This is the most popular model here, which is the Western Red Cedar. It's a beautiful wood. You can keep looking like wood if you give it TLC every 6 or 12 months or so and add your oil. Then you can have this beautiful looking wood. With the other wood types, you can go for a painted finish. Generally, the other wood types, being the Paulownia and Araucaria, will look get covered in mildew, which isn't an issue for the bees, but it just doesn't look that great, so we would recommend painting those other wood types. So there's really a wood type choice, and then there's a size choice. So the Flow 6, which is the equivalent size of an 8-frame Langstroth, so it's got 8 brood frames in the bottom here, 6 flow frames in the top here. You can see that beautiful nectar coming in. That is the most popular size by far. It's just a bit lighter to lift the boxes off, and for most people it's a good size. But in the colder regions that get really cold, people generally go for a slightly bigger size, which is called a 10-frame Langstroth. So if you have a look at this one here, you've got 10 frames in the brood box, so you've got an extra 2 frames that the bees can build up to a slightly bigger size colony and even store a bit of honey on the edges for the winter. And in the top, you've got 7 flow frames. Flow frames are a little bit wider, that's why the numbers don't match up. You can see that nectar really coming in now, and they're converting it into honey. It's a beautiful thing. So general rule of thumb would be, if you're in the colder regions, go for the bigger size, which is our Flow Hive 7, and go for the Flow Hive 6 probably everywhere else. And the advantage of starting with a flow hive is you don't need to get the other equipment, the extractor, the press, or whichever way you're going to harvest your honey. And harvesting honey is actually quite easy. You'll see us turning the handle and harvesting honey straight into the jar. So there's not the learning curve there with removing the frames, cutting the capping off, spinning it, and all of that. So it is attractive, and it's just a bit easier to get going and harvest your honey than the conventional ways. So certainly would recommend the flow hive for beginners.
Great, we've got Aaron, who's just starting out beekeeping. He's there in Sydney, and it's heard it's better to start. Is it better to start with 1 or 2 hives? And they've heard that really having 2 is no more trouble than 1.
I'd always recommend having multiple hives, and the reason why is that sometimes your colony will go through a bit of a weak phase and they're not really producing any honey, and sometimes they're producing an amazing amount of honey. And if you have 4 hives, for instance, you'll find 2 might go amazingly well and produce a lot of honey. 1 might be a bit average and might not get honey till later in the season. Another one might not get honey at all. So if you want to increase your chances of getting beautiful stores and being able to harvest all the different flavours of the seasons, then go for more than 1 hive. The other reason is, if a hive goes queenless, for instance, which is a thing that can happen, and they haven't got it together to make a new queen, then you'll need to introduce some resources from another colony for them to make a new queen, or you'll need to buy in a queen, which in the end comes from another hive. So having multiple hives means that you could get some resources out of this box and shift it to this box to fix the issue of not having a queen over here. So definitely more hives than 1 is better.
Thanks, Cedar. Does the flow hive produce the honey quicker than a traditional hive?
Once the frames are all waxed up, and they're really performing just like any other frames, because they're all coated in wax, they're honeycomb cells, and and the bees will get in there and fill it up when the nectar flow is there. So in that way it's the same. Some people find, especially in areas where there's a really slow nectar flow, that it might take them a while to get started for that first time on the frames. Having said that, once your bees are really storing honey in the frames, it can happen amazingly fast. And when you are harvesting, let's say you get in here and you harvest this full frame here, you might find even in a day or two that they've filled it up again, which is very exciting when that happens. And they don't have to rebuild the wax from the beginning again. So you've got a bit of a savings there. You're not, that's if you're taking out and crushing the wax and getting them to start again. And it has been said that 7 kilograms of honey gets used to make 1 kilogram of wax. So there's a slight efficiency there where all the wax, even the capping, stays inside the hive for the bees to reuse and recycle, and you've got a little bit of an efficiency gain there. But otherwise I'd say it's pretty similar.
Right. Turtle Invader from South Texas is asking, if the queen lays eggs in the flow frames, is there an easy way to get them out, or do you just wait for the eggs to hatch?
Okay, so there's a couple of reasons why you might get eggs laid in the flow frames. The most common thing that can happen is actually the hive goes queenless. They don't have a queen down the bottom, and if they're left for a long time without a queen, the workers can actually start laying eggs, and they'll lay them all over the place. They'll lay them in the flow frame cells, they'll lay them on the sidewalls, and generally they're unfertilized eggs and they'll turn into drones. So unfertilized eggs turn into drones. So you get a whole lot of male bees emerging from cells up here in the flow super and also down the bottom, and you'll need to rectify that situation by introducing a new queen or introducing resources for them to make one. The longer they're queenless, the harder it gets for them to actually take a new queen. So it'd be good to get onto that. The other reason it could happen is if the queen, either you weren't running an excluder. Having said that, I've got hives I don't run excluders on, and it's very queen specific. One queen won't lay in the flow frames, and one queen will lay in the flow frames. But once you've got a queen that doesn't, then she won't, and you can go on using that hive while that queen is in reign in the hive, and you won't need to use an excluder. However, if you are using an excluder and the brood is being laid in the top and not in the bottom, then it could be the case that the queen snuck through the excluder when she was small, before she really put on enough weight and sized up, and she ended up stuck in the top box. If that situation's occurred, getting back to your question, then you'll need to shake all the bees downstairs, or find the queen and put her downstairs. But if you can't find the queen, then the easy way to go is to shake and brush the bees off all the frames, down into the bottom box, put your excluder back on, put the flow frames back on, and then wait. So you'll need to wait at least 11 days for brood to emerge from the cells. Actually wait 21, because there could be an egg, and there's a 21-day life cycle of the worker bee. Wait till they've emerged. The bees will then go on and use the flow frame cells for storing their nectar and producing their honey, and it actually won't affect the frames. So simply just wait 21 days, and then you can go about harvesting if your frames are full again.
Great. Jordan's asking, lives in a very humid environment in Miami, Florida. Cedar, what are your thoughts on, do you think that they could leave their super on all the time?
I certainly think so. We live in this subtropical region here, and we leave our supers on all year round, and it's not a problem at all. The only time I would take a super off is if the colony got really weak. I just wanted them to have less space to defend. Let's say they went queenless, you didn't notice for some time, and you were trying to really resuscitate that colony. You might take the super off and then just give them less space to look after. We've got the small hive beetle here, which will get in and take advantage of your brood box when the colony's weak, when there's not enough bees to really manage and cover all of the surfaces of the combs. The hive beetles can take over and lay their eggs, so that would be the reason why I would take the super off. Otherwise, I'd just leave it on all year round.
Great. Jeshua was asking, how often do you like to inspect the flow frames, or do you inspect the flow frames?
So we inspect them out of curiosity to see what's going on, and we may also inspect them if we find there's a problem. Let's say one's getting stuck and we want to know why. Perhaps there's excessive propolis build-up, perhaps there's candy in the frames. It's not something that we don't really get candying issues here, but perhaps you're in an area that does have a lot of that. But perhaps you've noticed that you didn't get much honey out of the frame when you thought it was nice and full. You might want to investigate that by popping the lid and taking the frame out. And the other one is just in the beginning, while you're learning, to see what the windows look like here and what that means inside the hive. So if you see a filling pattern like this, where you're getting these beautiful lines of honey really building up like that, then you say there's a flow on, there's a nectar coming in, so you're going to get that all through your frame on the inside. However, if you're seeing a really patchy pattern where it was full and capped like this, but then there's cells starting to go missing here where they've eaten all the nectar out, then they could be eating the nectar out of the center of the frame as well. And if you want to know whether they are, you could pop the lid off and take those frames out and have a look and just start sort of connecting what the view is here and in the side windows and to what's actually happening inside the hive. But otherwise they are designed to stay on there. I would recommend leaving them on there if you can, unless you're in a really cold long winter area and it's time to remove the supers, because the bees look after them on there. If you take your super off and leave it around, then things like mold and vermin and wax moth come and just make a mess of them. It doesn't wreck them, but it's just not so nice for your frames, and then they need to go through a clean-up procedure. So certainly recommend keeping them on there if you can. As for inspecting, you don't have to inspect the frames like you do the brood box. It's a mandatory requirement to inspect the frames in your brood box for disease reasons, but the flow frames you don't have to.
Right, Phil from Ontario, Canada, is just thinking of adding a medium box between the brood and the flow hive for winter stores. Just wondering if you have an opinion on that. And by the way, he's just had his second batch of honey from the flow hive and he loves it.
Excellent, excellent. Good to hear about your honey in Canada. I'd love to taste that. It's amazing, the different types of honey everywhere in the world. It can be as unique as all the different flowers that we have producing nectar. As whether to add a medium, you certainly can do that. You can put a medium box, which for those that don't know is a smaller sized box, and you can get these frames to fit that, conventional wooden frames, and the bees will build their honey stores in those frames. So nice idea. It's not a bad size. In Canada you do have a long cold winter coming. If you can get them to store some extra, it'll be a good thing.
Fantastic. Cedar, can you harvest beeswax from the flow hive too?
You can. So there's a few ways of going about that. One is under the lid here, you could let them build up comb that you could harvest, crush and strain and use the beeswax, or you could, if you want to contain that a little bit, you can use one of those kind of Pyrex glass dishes and put that under the lid, taking the plug out of the inner cover, and let them get up in there and produce some wax. The other one is you can harvest honeycomb frames from the edge of the brood nest. Typically there'll be just honey on the edges, and when it comes time for spring management, it's not a bad idea to get into your brood box, get in there and put some fresh frames in the center and cycle out some of the ones on the edge, and that way you're continuing to swap out those frames as the years pass and giving them some fresh new wax for the queen to lay her eggs and raise her young. So you can harvest honeycomb frames from the edges of the brood box as well, or you could, like the last question, you could add another box, whether it be a medium or full size, specifically for honeycomb collection. There's no reason why you can't do that.
Great. Helga's asking, Cedar, do you have a good technique for taking off the super to inspect the brood box? Doesn't have a lot of upper body strength, but has a bit of trouble trying to lift it and also separate the super from the queen excluder.
Okay, if the super's been on there a long time and they've really connected it together, can be a bit of hard work to get them to separate. And sometimes the excluder stays with the top box and sometimes it stays with the bottom. If you have a look at our video last week, we showed you how to remove the 10 frame super because we were doing a full swap out from a conventional Langstroth hive to a flow hive. So have a look at that video, and it takes you through how to do it using your hive tool, cracking the boxes off. The way to lift a hive box is in the sideways direction. So you'd take the roof off because that makes it a little bit lighter to start with. You'd be in your bee suit, you would have been using your smoker. Then lifting in the sideways direction is easier. If you don't have a lot of strength or you've got back issues, then get somebody to help you. Honey boxes can be heavy if they're full. But the way I do it is I use this area here, which is a really nice, big, generous handle, and the handle on the other end of the box. Lifting in this way is far easier than lifting in this way. You can take the windows out here and lift in that way if you want to, but keeping the weight closer to you is better. Then I use my body strength, not so much as in just a raw lift up like that, but more a lean back. Once you've got separation and you've really levered all the way around, I tend to even put my knee against the bottom hive and just lean back and rock it off. And then if you have another or a bit of a stand to put it on, or a couple of old boxes, then you can simply just pivot and put it down without having to go through that big lift like your weightlifting. Having said that, get some help. Honey boxes can be heavy. So a few tips there on removing your super.
Great. Andy's asking now, so this is now about removing the super. Just wondering about if there's unkept honey, what do you need to remove the super before winter?
So that's a great question, and it depends a lot on where in the world you are and what kind of climate you're in. So as said, I'm no expert in these matters as we don't have long cold winters. This is our winter here and we've got beautiful honey flowing in. So you best to get information from your local beekeepers, and if you've got experience of whether to remove your super, how to store it, put it in the comments below, help answer the question. But basically, the factors you're thinking of are making sure your colony has enough stores to last. You may need to feed your colony to build up stores. So typically you will be leaving your box in a configuration for winter where you've got a brood box and a full box of honey stores. If you've got multiple boxes, then you'll be removing those supers off the hive and storing them for winter. So let's say you've got 2 flow hive supers on here and you're deciding to remove one of them to reduce the size for winter, and that one, as you said, has nectar in it. Now, here in this humid tropical climate, we can remove the super, brush the bees out if they haven't already started to reduce in size and vacating that area. You would remove the the frames and put them into a freezer. The reason why is if the honey may start to ferment if it's just sitting around and the water content is still high because it's not capped honey. Hive beetle and things can get in there and take over, wax moth, etc. So kind of a chest freeze would be an ideal way to keep that, and then it's ready to go in springtime and the bees can pick up where they left off and continue to finish off that honey. If you're in a really cold area that's already cold, you may not need the chest freezer. You might just need to keep them in an area away from vermin so that they're good to go again when the weather warms up in the springtime. The other thing you could do is harvest the honey and then take that honey box off for the winter. So that's another way you could go. Now you're still going to be left with somewhat sticky frame after harvesting. So in this humid climate, you wouldn't want to leave them around or the mold will set in. It's still best to keep them in a freezer, but if you're in a more warm, temperate environment, you might not need to remove the super at all. So a bit of a convoluted answer, best to get the answers straight from the people in your area. Find out about how cold it is and whether you do actually need to remove your honey super for winter.
Great, thanks Cedar. So if you've taken off your super and you've stored your flow frames, do you just take off the queen excluder and then just leave the roof on and the inner cover?
Yes, that's right. You could leave the queen excluder on if you wanted to. It's up to you, but generally you'd be taking off the box, the excluder, and then just getting it back to a single brood box, inner cover and roof. In those cold areas, you might decide to put a little extra insulation in the roof area. You can do that by cutting some pieces of, say, styrofoam. It's very insulating, and putting that in the roof cavity. Some people do that. Some people will wrap their entire hive in insulated material. Others say no, it's best to let the box walls get nice and cool. Condensation in the hive is a water source for the bees. So there's a bit of arguments to and fro as to whether to wrap your hive up for winter if you've got snow ahead. Michael Bush in Nebraska, very cold area, he just digs his hives out of the snow. He doesn't insulate, doesn't wrap, and says they're fine come springtime. So there's various different opinions on what to do, and he's using open mesh bottom boards without even any tray underneath. So there's all sorts of opinions on what you should and shouldn't do. In the end, listen to the opinions, work out what you want to do for yourself, and try it, see if it works for you, and learn. That's what it's all about. We're trying things, learning, and also learning from those around you.
Great, Cedar. And so through winter, if you've taken your super off and you've just got your brood box, do you need to be if it's really cold, should you inspect your brood box through winter or just leave it till spring?
Generally you'll be leaving it till spring. If you've got some nice warm sunny days that happen in winter, you could have a look then, but generally you don't want to disturb that process. They've got enough honey to survive. You're just fingers crossed they're going to make it through. If you sense that they've run out completely of honey stores, and you might do that just by lifting the hive and sort of getting an idea of how heavy it is, then you may decide to feed them something to get them through that last part of winter. Again, you'll be choosing the warmest day you could find. Some people do a dry sugar feed at that point just to give them something, just by pouring some sugar into some of the brood frames and putting them back in. Others might have another feeder already installed for the winter, going through the hole in the lid. There's a few different feeder options available. Not something we need to really do in this area, but in those long winter areas you may need to feed your bees to build up the stores, ideally before winter, but in the end, if you've left it too late and perhaps the season didn't go as you thought and there's nothing ahead for them, you're better off feeding them than not. You're better off letting your bees, giving them a chance to survive than letting them starve.
Great. Cedar, if you're wanting to have a 3-stack flow hive, is it better to have 2 brood boxes or 2 supers?
So you could go either way. there's certainly people that like to have a second brood box, and certainly people that like to have a second super. So you could go either way on that one, depending on what you want to do. Generally, I find that enough area, if you add up all the cells in the brood box, in a single brood box, to build up a very large colony. There's a lot of cells there for the queen to lay eggs in, so it doesn't seem, in my mind, a reason why you need a second brood box. When I find you put a second brood box on, it mostly ends up as honey stores.
Great. Tommy's asking, I think maybe referring to the classic hive, wondering about the hive bug trap that you made with the cloth and how you actually did that.
Okay, that's going back a while to the very beginning. I remember that. So that was if you get those the kind of material at the takeaway restaurants that have those checkered kind of vinyl finishes, and on the other side it's got this fluffy kind of surface, and that can be used to make a hive beetle trap. Those beetles get tangled with their legs in that kind of fluffy, it's a bit like Velcro on the back, and they get tangled in that, and because they've got these little spurs on their legs, and they eventually die. So it's one method of making a hive beetle trap. And you can go to a material store that sells textiles, and usually you can buy that stuff by the roll, and you can cut out a square. The important thing with an open mesh a screened bottom board is make sure the bees can't get out, or they'll try and pull it off the screen. They'll get down there and grab hold of it and kind of pull it up. So if you have our classic model, then attach the cloth to the core flute slider using some double-sided tape or glue, and then put that core flute in the lower position, allowing some space between the mesh and the material so that the bee on that fluffy tablecloth.
David's asking, if you do leave the super on all year round, what are your thoughts on actually feeding the bees if you need to?
So generally, the reason you'd feed bees is if they don't have stores to last a long time without flowers, which is typically the winter in those colder regions. And the time you'd be feeding is just before that time. The idea is the bees use up all of that, let's say you're feeding them sugar syrup to store in the frames, you'll be using what's called a thick syrup. They will store in the frames either in a conventional super or a flow super, and they'll store and cap it off just like honey, and that can be a store for them to survive the winter. So you'll be doing it prior to that time. That way they've used up all of those stores before the springtime, because you don't want to be harvesting honey that's actually sugar.
Fantastic, Cedar. Do you recommend, if you do take your hive off, should you repaint it? And if you've got the cedar, what would you recommend to use on it?
Okay, not a bad idea. If you've got the box off, why not give it a little TLC? Generally, if you're trying to keep wood looking good for the long term, this box has done a few seasons, and we recently gave it a little sand and re-oil, and it comes back looking quite good. It's a little bit of effort, but if you're trying to keep wood looking this beautiful kind of finished wood look outdoors, then you'll always be fighting nature a little bit. It'll be trying to turn it grey, trying to, in the end, turn it back to the earth. So you could just go with it and go for the grey look, which some people go for, and they're just letting their hive go grey. But if you want to keep it looking this beautiful finished wood, then you will need to give it a little TLC. So ideal time once the box is off. However, you can do it when the bees are in it as well. Use your protection, especially if you're new to beekeeping. Get in your bee suit and make sure you are protected while you are working your hive with bees in it. Especially if you're using an electric sander, you could upset your bees a little. The finishes, the ones we're finding are the most long-lasting are the ones that are built for outdoor decking. Now, often they have a tint in it, which gives a more stained look, if that looks not for you, you can get ones that don't have the stain in it. However, the stain does stop greying from UV, so UV over time will grey your wood, and the stain protects against that. So if you want a really long lasting wood finish, then go for the outdoor decking products. If you want a more a beautiful wood look without the stain, then you could try the ones without it, where you are finding some success with the non-stained decking products as well.
Great. Cedar, if flow hive beekeepers are leaving their supers on, is there any recommendation as to how many honey frames you should leave for them over winter?
So that will depend on your area, and also depend on the beekeeper and their recommendations. So I've been to the southernmost state here in Australia, Tasmania, where one commercial beekeeper said you need to have a trickle of honey to survive, and it has to be a 10 frame size. I've gone around the corner to another commercial beekeeper and they've said no, a setup like this is fine to get through the winter. So you get these varied opinions, and it's generally based on something that's worked for them and been successful for them. So that's in our extremely cold areas. So if you're in Canada, say, then it may be the case that you do need 2 boxes for your colony to survive the winter. And if you're in the not so cold as Canada, then 1 box of stored honey is generally fine for your bees to survive the winter. And if you're in areas like this, then you don't need any honey at all. The bees will forage in winter and collect their stores as usual.
Great, and Fred Dunn's joined us and answering lots of questions as well. So morning, evening, Fred.
Great, if you could post your videos on overwintering, that'd be fantastic in the comments. Fred's got some great, nicely produced videos he's done on all sorts of things he does when he's preparing his hives for the winter to come.
Great. Cedar, if it is really cold and wet, is it all right to put your hive under cover, or should you make a little beehive house for it?
Certainly. So in Europe, there's actually been a long tradition of making houses for your bees, a whole honey house, perhaps housing, say, 40 or more colonies under a roof, and the beehives kind of form the walls of that house. So certainly if you have the luxury of being able to have a roof over your hive, then go for it. It will protect your wood, it'll keep your hive drier, it'll keep your hive cooler in summer, and it's a great thing. However, bees are very resourceful, and they will actually survive in the sun, the heat of Australian summer, no problem, and in the cold winters as well. So it's not a necessary thing, but it's a nicety if you can put your hive under a roof.
Great. Actually, following from that, Cedar, a person who lives way up north in Australia where it's really, really hot, can you have beehives anywhere, like in any part of the country?
You certainly can. So it's amazing how bees can survive in all of the different climates of the world. We have hives in 130 different countries, and in all of those places, from very hot, dry, arid climates to very wet, humid climates to freezing cold snow where the sun's only around for a few months of the year, like in Norway. And it's amazing that the honeybee can survive all of those times. The easiest beekeeping is in places where you can the bees can access forage all year round, like here. It certainly is easy for us. We can leave our honey supers on all year round, and the season kind of ebbs and flows with honey that comes and goes, and when you see it building up, you can have some honey and share in the amazing produce they make. And when there's not, then you can leave it for them. It's so if you're up north in those really humid areas, then you can certainly harvest honey most of the year round. If you've got long wet seasons that could limit the bees foraging. So in those really wet season times, you might find there's not enough honey being stored for you to harvest in those times, and you might find that winter is the time when you're producing a lot of honey.
Great, and I've got a lucky last question here for you, Cedar. Are any of the timbers better, you know, what's the word I'm thinking, a lot thermally, like insulated? As the cedar, is it better to have the cedar in the colder climate or the araucaria? Do they have different thermal properties?
Yes, but the difference is probably minor. I don't think you're going to get an amazing difference. Actually, the paulownia does have insulating properties that are slightly better than the cedar and araucaria, but it's going to be pretty similar to the cedar. So your choices are going to be more around the look. If you're going to paint it anyway, then there's probably no need to go to the expense of the cedar, unless you particularly just want to have that wood. If you're going to paint it, then you could use the paulownia or the araucaria, and if you're going to keep this beautiful stained wood look, then the cedar is a must for that. We had to keep that look going on the araucaria and the paulownia. Thank you very much for watching. Again, if you've got things you'd like us to cover, tune in again next week. Put it in the comments below, and hopefully we'll get to answering all your questions. And best of luck with your beekeeping. It's such a fascinating and rewarding thing to be looking after bees. They get to do their amazing pollination, and if you look after them, you get that beautiful reward of honey. There's a lot of honey coming in now. We'll have some harvesting videos coming up for you as